Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we are talking about
pitfalls to labeling people good or bad. So there's a lot of things that we're going to talk about with this. Why don't you give the lead in about what you had in mind in talking about these pitfalls?
So just the idea of labeling someone as unadulterated good or evil. This idea of someone has a purely good character or a purely evil character, and thus that then transfers that goodness or that evilness to all the actions that they might take throughout their entire lives, and how this way of thinking about yourself and others has a lot of downsides. It's not that we can't use the words good or bad, but we should be really careful about how these words can lead us to some potentially negative outcomes.
Yeah, it reminded me as you were saying that about, like in mathematics, we say, well, one thing is equal to another thing, or we use these metaphors of from a good tree comes good fruit, or this transfer that we seem to assume takes place for a good person. They're always going to be doing good actions, and so when we see them doing something that's kind of sketchy, we're like, well, they must have a good reason for it. Or somebody who we think is bad, even if they do something good, we're like, well, they must have some nefarious purposes behind what they're doing, even though they are helping the old lady across the street. It's probably so they can mug her afterwards, or just to look good enough that they can take us off our guard. And it could be, I suppose, not just their actions, but maybe also people connected to them. So from good parents, we should expect really good children, right? Or vice versa. And then we're surprised when we find out that somebody who, is a really great person turned out to have awful parents or siblings or coworkers or things like that. So why do you think people buy into this? Why do people need others or themselves to be totally good or totally bad?
To a certain extent, it's just an easy heuristic. A heuristic is just an idea of a rule of thumb that usually results in good answers. And so it's if you go to Daniel Kahneman's and Alex Tversky's book Thinking Fast and Slow, you've got Thinking Fast, where you I can come to a conclusion about something, and 90% of the time it's the correct outcome, and that's really good because it takes a lot less mental capacity to do that. But if I want to actually think about things step by step and really get into the nuance, that is actually really difficult, both in brain power, the caloric expenditure to actually do that, and so our bodies are let's optimize these things. We don't want to be using all those calories to look at the nuance or everything. Let's have some hard and fast rules, and it's they work most of the time and they get us through life, but sometimes they're very wrong.
Yeah, and I suppose we could go beyond without saying that the biological stuff isn't there. We could also say there's cultural factors that some groups are they tend more to labeling people like that, and others maybe encourage more nuance or discrimination, we could say. Although we'd have to, specify which ones we're talking about there, and avoid falling into calling one the good group and one the bad group in that respect as well.
Yeah, and you see this happen with the first thing that comes to mind is the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, and they're the same people, and a artificial designation was used to divide up this population. It was based upon the colonial powers, saying the one group was the good group because they were the taller group, and they
Longer
had
heads
more,
too, yeah.
more European longer heads or something. And then they used that to pit this people against each other and demonized one to the point where neighbors were unfortunately hacking up other neighbors. It was absolutely reprehensible, but it was they applied this label of bad against this one group and allowed that to be morally, at least at that moment, to be expected that you're going out to stop the bads.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This is a little bit off topic, but I do a lot of work on anger research in philosophy, and one of the things that Thomas Aquinas says that I think is like totally on point about anger is that it realizes that it's imposing something bad on somebody else. So you impose an evil, as he says, a malum, on somebody else. But in this case, it's okay because it's somehow like setting things right. So it's part of a bigger picture. Like maybe you're doing it because you're retaliating against them, you're paying them back for something they did, or they shouldn't have crossed a certain line, or they impeded you in something that you yourself desire. And so what we can recognize as generally bad when we're angry, and I think we could say something similar about hatred too, we come to view that as a good, and then we can justify doing all sorts of things to people. You think about people too who will say things like, if you hurt me, I'll hurt you 7 times, and it just sort of ratchets it up, or as we say, escalates things. I think part of the mindset behind that, because there's not that many people who just say, as Faust did, evil be thou my good, right? Most people are doing things that are bad, harmful, injurious to other people because they do see it in some respect as something good or reasonable for them to do. So looking at these mindsets where people label themselves, label their friends, label their enemies as totally good or totally bad is, I think this could be quite useful.
Mm-hmm. So what was this from Alexander Solzhenitsyn that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, so he had this great quote, and now he's somebody who suffered quite a lot, right? If you don't, you know his backstory, I think.
I
right?
don't. No.
Oh, so he was in World War II, and I believe he was in the tank corps, on the Russian side fighting against the Germans, and he got sent to the gulags. And the reason he did is because he made a joke about Stalin in one of the letters that he was sending back home, and the KGB would they'd open everybody's letters and take a look to see if there was anything that they shouldn't have in there. And making a joke about the great leader was, that was enough to get you sent to the gulags. And the gulags were these prisons that were not just prisons. They were work camps and they were death camps. So the idea was that, the Russians, and they'd been doing this, long before the communist revolution and the communist state, they'd been sending people to Siberia to be outside of Russian society, and then also to slowly convert this wilderness, very tough wilderness too, into something that would be livable for Russians, sort of colonizing and civilizing it. And it was incredibly expensive in terms of lives, but they had many people, and this is one way to sort of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You take your political prisoners and send them out there, work them, giving them very little food until they eventually die of exposure, malnutrition, or the guards beat them or something along those lines, or kill themselves out of despair. So Solzhenitsyn got sent into he'll later publish a 3-volume set of books called the Gulag Archipelago, these camps that were spread all throughout Siberia. And so he got to see a lot of human nature in its very unvarnished state close up. And so this is the thing that he had to say about evil and good. He said, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. but the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? So there's a couple things going on there. The very last thing, maybe there is some badness within most of us. I'll say there's certainly some within me, and we're reluctant to look at it. We're reluctant to take it on, and so it's easy to call ourselves good and just pretend like everything is wonderful, and then we project it outward, the badness, onto other people, and say, well, they're the bad ones. But really, even if they are bad, they're not totally bad. There's some goodness in them. Every human heart, or whatever you want to call it, psyche, mind, is going to have some good and some bad elements. It's very rare that we run into somebody who's like totally, completely good or totally, completely evil.
Yeah. It also a little bit reminds me of the Stanford Prison trial experiments, as well as Hannah Arnett's The Banality of Evil. Just like seeing how either regularly could be good people do really incredibly evil things, and other contexts that would change.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit leery about the extrapolation from the Stanford Prison experiment for two reasons. One is that I think it tells us much more about the people that they selected, who are college students. The other is that we know there's problems with the study design because they came out later on, but it has become sort of a trope that you find in everybody's psychology and business leadership textbooks and things like that. And we can point to many other cases where people have, once given the authority to do so, done bad things to other people with, impunity, really.
So is your feeling that it's not a absolute that there's still people that will buck the system.
Oh yeah,
that's your.
Because historically we see that, yeah. Well, no, that's a quibble with it. I mean, right. That's sort of my biggest quibble with it, is that these psychological experiments very often tell us much more about the typical undergraduate at Stanford than they do about like the rest of the people in the neighboring city who weren't drawn into the experiment.
What is that acronym? Is like a white affluent male. As like all these experiments are done on college students, not so male anymore, but like they used to be, as like everything was just like a whole bunch of affluent white guys.
Yeah, and you can even say the generalizations. I mean, they talk about, if I remember right, and I don't remember exactly how the acronym goes, but weird countries, right? A lot of times, maybe this is a sort of a broader topic, we focus in on a group for study, and we assume that they stand for everybody. As a matter of fact, again, if you don't mind veering a little bit off topic, somebody who I was just shooting some lecture videos on today, David Hume, the great skeptic 18th century philosopher, he says some stuff that is almost amazing when you read it in print, but you do see people assuming this quite often. And so he, as much as David Hume said, well, you can't, you can never know cause and effect, and everything is just probabilities. He said that human nature is basically the same everywhere, at every time, in every culture, and we can know all about the Romans or ancient Chinese, or about, what people would be like in the distant future by extrapolating from ourselves. We can think about what, in his view, Englishmen in the 18th century are like, and the same basic motives, the same basic passions are guiding everybody. It's just like basically we're changing costumes and names and stuff like that. And you say to yourself when you read that, well, how would you possibly know that? I mean, even if you weren't a skeptic, how would you possibly know that? How can you go back in time and make these sort of assumptions? I mean, the little windows that we have into what was happening, say, in Roman society are very small and far between, right?
And it's mostly the ruling class that we know about. So, like,
exactly.
What is society like on the street?
Yeah, I mean, that's why the discipline of cultural history developed, and the focus on like looking at material artifacts and reconstructing what it was like for other people other than just the writers of the chronicles. But I think this is a very common thing. It's not just David Hume who thinks that you can do this. I think that many people are prone to assume that if you know this group here, you can easily imprint that or infer from that to what any other group would be like. So coming back to the Stanford Prison experiment, well, it doesn't really matter that we've just got a bunch of college students and no townies in the experiment. It's just fine, Mm-hmm. We can judge what people will do on that basis. And then, once it gets into what we could call the collective hopper of stuff that's taken as true, then everybody else picks it up, and they do so unquestioningly, as if...
And that was the problem with the reconstruction of the when you do another experiment and it's not actually a replication problem.
I mean, the social sciences seem to have a pretty bad track record when it comes to a lot of these really important... there's a word for it, not flagship, but something along those lines, keynote experiments, right?
Mm-hmm. The whole power poses was one of the big ones. Everyone loved it. It was that big TED Talk, and then no one could replicate it.
Well, I mean, since we're already off topic, really, my own personal point of view is if it's actually in a TED Talk, it's probably wrong. Because what happened, and again, we can circle back to our topic. What are TED Talks? They're these very produced ways of talking. They're their own genre. You're supposed to have slides behind you. You come up with some catchy intro. I've actually given a TED style talk, and there were people like coaching me on, you need to take out all this content here. Mm-hmm. It was about anger management. People aren't going to want to hear quite so much. And I was like, well, this is kind of important stuff. And if they had their druthers, it would have been reduced to 10 minutes of complete soundbite drivel. And when you listen to TED Talks, when it's about something that you don't really know that much about, you're like, oh yeah, that's really cool. That sounds good. When you actually know the topic, you're like, wow, this is off base, and people are going to really draw the wrong conclusions about this stuff because they left out this, and this sweeping claim that they made doesn't hold up. They got to make all sorts of qualifications. And I think we can say the same thing coming back to our topic about labeling people as good and bad. It's sort of the equivalent of TED Talk culture, where we're like, well, that person is, and we don't say good or bad in TED Talks. We're like innovative, amazing, mind-blowing,
synergy.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, coming back to good and bad, the basic idea here is there's usually this false dichotomy of good or bad, that either someone is a good person or a bad person, whereas there's definitely a spectrum here, or maybe a spectrum's not even good, but look at the aggregate of their actions, and you can label each one of those actions good or bad.
And it's not just actions too that we have to think about. It's also like motivational structure, mm-hmm. which might be revealed by what they're doing consistently over time and what they seem to value, or they might just come straight out and tell you, like, I'm doing, these actions that are being viewed as good, but I'm only doing them because I'm a selfish person who wants you to like me,
or like, I'm a unfettered capitalist. I just I'm going to give you a product at the lowest price possible because I want money, and there's no exterior motive besides him increasing his own wealth. It's based on avarice.
Yeah. Although it's funny. There's a lot of people who portray themselves as being worse people than they are in terms of their motivational structures because they've been told that they need to do that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Like you think about
in like getting ahead in business.
Yeah, if you're in a very competitive field, you're not going to say something like, I want to make a lot of money so that I can be a philanthropist later on, and not just so I can like get invited to luncheons with important people and, have a statue of me in the town hall. I actually want to like make people's lives better, like, build libraries or, hospitals or something like that. If you were to say that like in certain business areas, people would look at you and be like, well, I don't trust that guy. I want everyone to be just in it for the money. And I think there's guys who pretend to be tougher than they are. When they're secretly doing good deeds on the side and they don't want anyone to know that, and we could go on and on with examples like this. There are people who portray themselves as more selfish or worse than they actually are. And why do they do that? Because they think if they don't do that, something worse will happen, right?
Right. And so this idea of like we touched on it a little bit before, like good people transferring their goodness or badness, I guess, onto their actions.
Yeah.
And like I don't want to go and bring about Godwin's law, but I am.
Go ahead. You got to say what it is, though.
Godwin's law is in any internet discussion, there will always be a point where someone brings up Hitler.
If it goes on long enough, right? I think
and so
you're skipping to the right ahead to that point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or maybe on the whole of Wisdom for Life as a podcast, we've now hit it. So Hitler is absolutely reprehensible. About as far down that like bad end of this good bad spectrum as we possibly can. But he did love his dog, and so like loving your dog is a bad thing. I guess that's not how I usually represent that action. But if you use the idea that the bad person transfers his badness to all of his actions, or all actions, then his loving of a dog is a bad, which just doesn't seem to compute with reality.
I've seen people doing this with vegetarianism because Hitler was a vegetarian. So they're like, oh, you don't want to be like that guy, And there are so many arguments that are made that way and I think in a lot of cases the person doesn't really believe that the action is that way. They're doing it for rhetorical purposes, but they'll say, well, Hitler did this, so therefore you doing this sort of thing. Hitler breathed oxygen, so you got to find like nitrogen or hydrogen or something, some other alternative to that. I mean, it gets quite ridiculous when we go that far. In my classes, I usually don't let students talk about Hitler, in part because it's too easy. We all know that he was bad. So, saying that some sort of action is like an action that Hitler or the Nazis would do, there's a kind of sloppy, lazy thinking associated with that we want to encourage our students to get away from. And I don't let them do Stalin because that's the next one that they'll go to.
You got to be interesting. Vlad the Impaler or Caligula.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to have, in order to make these classes effective learning situations, there's got to be messier, more complicated examples to work with. That's also why I don't do trolley problems in class too, because it's too little cut and dried. I want complex situations like our messy, screwed up lives and our hard to make good decisions about, personalities and actions and motivational structures.
So I guess since we're talking about like bad people, what is the problem with calling other people bad? And this results in a number of potential pitfalls. One we've already figured out here is it might be rhetorically useful sometimes, but it's definitely not rational to make these associations between a good or bad person, however you want to define that, and their actions. And we all also talked about this idea of like what is why do people do bad ideas? And we can pull from the Meno, Plato's the Meno, discussing on I actually had that just in place over here. About why people do the good or the bad.
Yeah.
And
this is raising the issue of how people who know in general what the good is, how they wind up doing bad things, right?
Yeah. So, this is everyone desires the good. This is Socrates' position, and only do bad things because they have deceived themselves into thinking that the bad they're doing is good. And this kind of comes from this conversation between Meno and Socrates, where they're discussing what is virtue. And at one point in time, Meno says the virtue is desiring fine things and being able to acquire them. And Socrates says, like, oh yes, well, I've got something to come back at you with that. And it's like, so those who don't recognize bad things for what they are don't desire bad, but what they think is good, though in fact it is bad. Those who through ignorance mistake bad things for good, obviously desire the good. Do they not? And I think you push back against this at some points.
You mean in terms of like making it into a sort of sweeping, covers everything principle to describe things? Yeah, I mean, I personally do think that there are some people who will recognize something as bad in some sense, and they will still want it, pursue it. We could think about addicts, for example, as one class of people. If they're not too far gone, they know that what they're addicted to is bad for them, at least, maybe bad in general, and that they should avoid it, but they find themselves compelled to, and then they feel bad about it afterwards. They feel regret and shame and things like that. But there's other people who are, like you think about the sadist who desires to inflict pain and humiliation on another person. If you go to them and you say, well, you're really just mistaken about, what's good and bad. Don't you understand that inflicting pain is a bad thing? Look at how that person's suffering over there. And they're like, yeah, that's exactly what I want. I like that over there. And then, so your first approach to them is unsuccessful. Now you can like bump it up to another level, which I think we have to do in some of these cases, and say, well, see, that person has got a distortion in another way. They think that doing things that they know to be bad is actually good. Mm-hmm. So that you could say, well, they still do pursue the good, but it's a more complicated structure. It's not so simple as, well, there's just an easy mistake that they made, and we can steer them and show, oh, it's not nice to hurt other people. Wouldn't you have a better life if you got along with everyone? There are some people who are like, no, I hate everybody else. I want to make their lives miserable. That will be that will be what will make me feel happy or good.
And one of the worst examples of someone thinking that they're doing the good was the whole eugenics movement. They're like, we're going to make a better human race by, murdering people and like castrating them, or at least chemically. It's
interesting when you read the stuff that those people were writing, like in letters to each other, or saying. There was that idealistic aspect to it, right? You got to break some omelets to make good eggs, and we're going to get rid of all the bad eggs, and we can mix metaphors all we want, right? So there is that side. And then there were other people. You always get some people who are like, this is going to be a good vehicle for me to do the things that I want to do to other people because I hate those people. I can't wait to see them wiped off the face of the earth. And there's a good bit of that in there as well. Anytime that you see a reference to mongrels or things like that, you got to like be, your ears kind of prick up, and you're like, I don't know that that's just a genteel word for what they considered to be lower, and there's no emotional investment on their part. That's kind of looking forward to getting rid of that whole group of people. So I think there's, with any movement like that, there's a complicated set of motives, and the same person could start out with one set of motives and then emerge 5 years later with another set of motives. Mm-hmm. Maybe, we do see this sometimes. People get into things for one set of reasons, and then they come out after having had certain experiences on the other side with others. I'll give you an example that's a good transformation. When I was teaching at Indiana State Prison in the Ball State, prison college thing where they'd earn a 4-year degree, they got 8 semesters, and that was it on the grant that they were being given by the state of Indiana. And a lot of the prisoners would come in, and you'd ask them, they'd be kind of a pain in your class. You'd be like, why are you here? And they'd be like, I want to get out of the cell. This is something to do. Or I'm interested in the time cut that I'm going to get. Because they would get, if they got an associate's, they'd get 1 year off their sentence, and a bachelor would take another 2 years. And some of those guys would be like that 2 years into their education. And I would see the same guys because I was one of the few people who taught philosophy and religious studies classes there. So I'd get the same guys in my classes. And then every once in a while you'd see this turnaround happen where they realized that education was actually a good thing, and that they'd been wasting their time up until now, kind of like pushing against us, and now they wanted to get as much knowledge out of us and the classes and the materials as possible. And sometimes they'd express regrets. They'd be like, man, I kind of like, I got my good grades, but I didn't learn that much in the first 2 years because I was trying to cut corners, and I wasn't receptive. I've only got 2 more years left. I got to make the most out of this. Now, those are two very different motivational structures, right? And the same thing could happen with any sort of cause, I think.
That must be really gratifying for that turnaround to happen.
Yeah, and it's completely contingent what it does. It's not like you could produce a class that would do that. Like when they talk about with therapy, a person has to want to make progress. It's the same way with, I think, personal development. You can like give them all sorts of resources, but until something happens where they're like, oh, I want a different course for my life, it's not gonna make any difference. So I think a lot of it depended on what was happening in the cell blocks,
So back to good and bad.
Yeah.
Calling other people bad. We define a person, and it's almost no person can be that perfect good person, and we all are gonna fail at some point in time. And so it's really hard to say if the good person is always good, then almost no one on Earth, or no one on Earth ever, has actually lived up to this moniker. And so it'd be really hard if that is your
impractical to use
standard.
Right? Yeah.
And you had something on misanthropy.
Yeah, this also comes out of a Platonic dialogue, the Phaedo, where Socrates is talking with his friends shortly before his execution in the prison cell in Athens. And he cautions them against what he calls misology. And he's going to use misanthropy as a way to understand misology. Misology is a distrust of arguments or of accounts, right? So logos is argument, misos is hatred. And he says, we don't have to worry too much about that. We could probably talk about that another time. The misanthropy part, Socrates says, how do people become misanthropes, right? Misanthropic. Yeah, there we go. What ends up, it's a process. They make a bunch of mistakes in uncritically assuming people to be good. And so instead of realizing that the majority of people are not good or bad exclusively, they're somewhere in the middle. Like you mentioned, a spectrum. Maybe they are on a genuine spectrum, or maybe it's sort of like there's a lot of good and bad interfused, or they're good some of the time and bad some of the time. It's very rare we find somebody who's like good all the time, or somebody who's bad all the time. Although maybe maybe we do encounter some who are kind of close to the edge. I don't think I see the perfect type, So Socrates says that people are foolish and imprudently trust people who are not completely good as if they were completely good. And what's going to happen if you do that? Well, you're going to get let down. Maybe you get taken advantage of, and I think a lot of us have lived through that sort of thing. We make friends with people and we really want our friends to be good people. So we assume that they are, and then they don't pick us up when they say that they're going to, or they walk out after you're running a tab or whatever it happens to be. It's moving day, they don't show up, or they only show up after everything's been moved, and then they eat your pizza and drink your beer, So that happens over and over and over again. And with each person, the person who's going to become a misanthrope doesn't learn the lesson. Because the lesson would be, I trust this person and they let me down. Oh, maybe I shouldn't place so much trust. Maybe I shouldn't assume that they're the wonderful, friend or whoever, benefactor that I thought they were, with a heart of gold and all those sorts of things. Maybe I should, look at them realistically. Instead, they go on to the next person and they do exactly the same thing. And then
I want to clarify.
Yeah.
You said this happens over and over and over again, and you're referring to different individual peoples that they place their trust, and then their trust is broken instead of one person constantly breaking their trust over and over again. Whereas
that would be
at that
worse.
point, but at least at that point, you'd have a much better reasoning to maybe cut that person out of your life.
There are people who, that's a great point. There are people who do that. Mm-hmm. They come back to the same screwed up person over and over again, treat them as if they're an angel, get screwed over by them, and then they're shocked and surprised once again. But with Plato, it's multiple people, and eventually they get to the point where they something switches and they go all the way to the other side and they say people are all bad, and so misanthropy is hatred of other human beings, but it's hatred because you think they're bad. So why trust anybody? People are all, evil or bad, or they're all going to let you down. And then that's just an uncritical of a position as the one that thinks that everybody's good. It's much better just to be realistic about it and say, well, if I don't know somebody, they're probably belonging here in the middle part between good and evil. If I'm in, an area where I know people are all antagonistic, like certain job settings, well, maybe I should actually assume that they're generally bad, although I shouldn't assume that they're all like the epitome of evil, Yeah,
they might go home to their family and they're like really good there, but like within the context of that job, they're who knows?
Yeah,
who knows?
I was just thinking of a Rick and Morty cartoon. You've seen.
Yes.
The one who's modeled after Freddy Krueger, I forget his name, but he's chasing them around.
Say it on our radio show here.
No, and he's got not scissors, but something on his fingers.
Yeah.
And he's chasing them around, saying, "You can run, but you can't hide. I'm going to kill you," et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And then he clocks out, goes home to his wife and kid, and they've all got the things on their hands too.
Yeah.
And
and he's a perfect model of a father, a good.
Well, first he screws up. Remember?
Oh yeah.
He brings his work stress home and says something mean to his wife, and she yells at him a bit, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to bring it home with me." So, yeah.
So, I want to go to the pitfalls on the other side of calling other people good, and when you call another person good, you support them implicitly, basically, and you can fall into the trap of calling all of their actions good, and you can attribute the value of good to profoundly evil acts, and we've seen this throughout history over and over and over again. A lot of times when we have people in power, especially within religious settings or academic settings or anywhere there's a large power dynamic.
Commercial settings too, I think.
Yeah.
Think about all the people who lost their life savings, the staff of Enron. Because they wanted to be good company people, and they looked at this guy, Kenneth Lay, and all of his cronies, and they seem really good people. They wouldn't screw us over.
Bernie Madoff was apparently really stand up in his community.
It's interesting. I read an interview with him, where at one point he wanted to try to cut it off, which would have meant the Ponzi scheme would have collapsed at that point, and he couldn't get people to not want to invest with him. So, yeah.
And so, and we've got a lot of examples of people that were at least at one point considered good, or others that are still considered good, but they have certain aspects to them that are not as good. And so,
yeah.
Bill Cosby, we got the whole Catholic priest issue. MLK, a great person, but had an extramarital affair, and it was used against him by his political opponents. Thomas Jefferson, slaves plus Sally Hemings. Alexander Hamilton, another extramarital affair. Many gurus, Bikram. What do you know about that?
Oh, well, he like a lot of these people who develop a following and are innovators in some way, right? I think that there's something about innovator culture that does this. They're going to like take whatever is available and turn it up to 11, to use Spinal Tap's phrase. So Bikram is one of these people who started doing hot yoga, and some of the people involved in the movement started saying, well, this guy is engaging in sexual harassment or actually, full-on sexual misconduct. And the dynamic then is, oh, you can't talk bad about the leader because he's so wonderful. People want to, change the subject to all the good things that this person is doing. And when you are a whistleblower or you are reporting somebody engaging in wrongful behavior towards yourself, you often get quite isolated within these communities. But then what ends up happening, they push some of the allegations under the proverbial rug, and the person is still going to keep doing what they're doing, sometimes emboldened by it, and eventually it all does come out, and then the people who were originally pushed out are vindicated in a way, but usually not in a way where like in a movie, oh, it's a wonderful ending and they walk off into the sunset. They're still, dealing with the trauma of having been told that they're the bad people, and may in fact even believe it themselves. And we see this with organization after organization after organization. It doesn't have to be a religious or political organization. It can be a union. It can be, we were talking about this case of the ethicist Thomas Poga, right, who was kind of a big name in analytic philosophy and ethics. Well, it turns out he was sexually harassing graduate students and coercing them. And, again, their allegations were typically dismissed. Oh, how can you, and people would say things like, how can you say this about him? His articles are so good. And it turns out that he was kind of a rotten person in that respect. Probably, again, not like totally evil. I'm sure he did a lot of good for other people, but he did some clearly wrong actions that hurt a lot of other people and created an environment where not only, when people like that do that, it's not only that they're doing bad actions by themselves, which is already bad enough, but the hypocrisy involved scandalizes so many other people and gets them to think, well, there's nothing to these institutions. Everybody in them is bad. Sort of like the misanthropy thing that we were seeing.
Right. So, the good caveat, or not caveat, the good nugget that we can definitely come from this is that we should definitely not listen to someone like totally uncritically and unconditionally. You really should, especially if you've got a feeling that this might be right, or this might be wrong, to take a step back, and realize that people can, even if you hold them in high reverence, can do some really weird and potentially evil things. And so I want to go to calling yourself good.
Okay. Do you want to call yourself good right now, or?
How about goodish?
Okay, there you go.
Moving towards good. So I guess within the Stoic tradition, or at least the ancient Stoics, a lot of them called themselves Procopton, which is those who are progressing towards a goal. And so the Procopton strives towards a continual progress towards the perfection of the idea of the Stoic sage. And so you can take the same idea and apply it to your own individual stated values and say, it's like, okay, I want to be a person that really exemplifies these things because that's what I consider to be the ideal of a good person. And you work at doing this thing because, once again, we're not perfect and we fail, and a lot of our motivation sometimes gets muddied by our biases.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a constant in any sort of virtue ethics approach. This, and it's kind of funny too, because you look at it from the outside. I think a lot of people who are attracted to virtue ethics originally, they're like, okay, how can I be virtuous right now? And you're like, well, it doesn't work like that. First you gotta come in who you are. You're kind of messed up. You probably don't know all the things that are off with you. You probably think you have some of the good traits that you do have are being obscured by other good traits that aren't really good, but you're just using to compensate for stuff. So now we just start engaging in analysis and trying to look at our habits and what we're doing, and we use the text to help us out. And then you become a little less screwed up, right? And then the tendency is to think, oh man, I've made it now. I'm totally virtuous, and that's just not how it works. It's a continual process. I think there's a lot of people who approach ethics in general as if it's like ticking off a bunch of boxes, and if you can just do that, then you're a goodie, and you don't have to do anything anymore. You've been certified.
And so this is the crux of the issue is kind of this idea between a stagnant mindset versus a growth mindset. And so stagnant mindset is like, oh yeah, I've ticked off all my boxes. I'm good. I don't have to work anymore. Whereas the growth mindset says that you always have some ability to improve upon yourself. And, in many aspects, be it ethics or like you want to be an artist and so you want to draw every day or what, there's a billion different things that we can try to become experts at. And we're not like just given certain innate abilities. Some people do have, innate abilities. Like Usain Bolt, definitely has the body type to be a very good runner. I will never be as good a runner as Usain Bolt is, but I can be a much better runner than I am right now.
Yeah, it's like Epictetus said, maybe I can't be Socrates, but I can at least be a better Epictetus, right?
Right.
It's interesting. One of the people I do a lot of work on is Saint Anselm of Canterbury, and he left behind these prayers and meditations, which were circulated around Europe actually among nobility and clergy, because he did some really interesting stuff in the rhetoric of prayer. And when you read this stuff and you look at his biography, he talks about himself. He's talking to God or to the saints, and he's supposed to be like unveiling who he is, and it turns out that he's in his view not that good of a guy, and he needs help. He needs to be restored to some sort of integrity. He uses ideas like his soul having sores and ulcerations on it from his bad actions. And now when you read his biography, you realize this guy didn't really do many bad actions. He was actually a pretty good guy. As a matter of fact, in many respects, he was quite exemplary. And he was even humble about being exemplary without being sort of a fake humility and stuff like that. So what's the disconnect between these, right? Well, there's an easy answer for that, which is he made a lot of progress. Mm-hmm. And the more progress that you actually do make in terms of moral goodness, the more you start to see other things, other parts of yourself that until then you weren't ready to really face. And now you can actually see them, and you're like, oh man, it's sort of like, like when you're building a house, or you're rehabbing a house, and you think you've got one thing to fix, and then you pull up some carpet, and you're like, oh, there's some nice floors under here. Mm-hmm. Let me go down in the basement and take a look at the joists. Oh man, they're rotten. We're going to have to replace those. And then as you're replacing them, you find something else that's kind of screwed up. Well, that's the way it works in personal development, and you're right. It could also be like musical talent or something like that. The better you get, the more you realize what you're not able to do.
Mm-hmm. And you're aware of all these different aspects that you never were aware as just a casual listener of music.
Yeah. I mean, could you say that the Stoics talk about philosophy as the art of living, right? Mm-hmm. So could we generalize that more and say that being able to discern between what's genuinely good and bad mm-hmm. is something that takes us a long time to develop, and we tend to screw it up quite a bit,
Yeah, but it's at least it gives us a roadmap for, like, they say you acquire virtue in order to lead a eudaimonic life, or like a virtuous life leads to a eudaimonic life, or a life that is of an excellent human, a
flourishing,
flourishing, yeah. And these are the things that you should probably be focusing on if you want to be a flourishing human being, but they are good in and of themselves.
Yeah. This is, again, a little bit off topic, but it seems like there's so many roads, so many approaches leading towards that, even within a one particular tradition, like, say, Stoicism. Mm-hmm. There's so many different practices that you can apply that lead into that. No single one of them is like the magic bullet, as they say, right?
Right. It's a cornucopia of different things that, when put together, tends to increase your excellence as a human, to get you closer to a more fulfilling life. The problem is like attention. It takes attention to actually look at yourself in a really critical manner, to be aware of your present actions and your present desires and your present impressions. But constant attention is really hard for a number of reasons, but like one of them is like just our biology. And so Herbert A. Simon is a Nobel Prize winning economist for the idea of bounded rationality, and this is kind of goes against this idea of Homo economicus, which was kind of like the ideal of a man that is personally rational. And so like the economics, like, oh yeah, well, if, we've got this perfectly rational set of people, and they all make perfectly rational arguments or like decisions, and that's how we're going to model economics, which is not any way in concordance with reality. And so his bounded rationality was some work that he helped put forward that, like, shows that every second we get about 11 million pieces of different information presented to us through our different senses, and we only have about enough attention to be conscious of about 40 of them, and all the others are our brain uses heuristics in a non-conscious portion of us to say, like, well, that's not useful at all, I'm going to ignore that, or hey, that stick on the ground, that looks like a snake, you should really pay attention to that.
Blurs things into each other. And
it like presents that to your more conscious mind. And this idea that, like, there's so much information that we're making all these unconscious decisions about is if we have bad heuristics, then these bad heuristics result in really potentially bad outcomes.
Yeah, and attention is something that can be developed. I mean, that's what meditative practices typically do. The Stoics, we're not sure exactly what they did in terms of that. We know they had practices that they were using, and they stressed what they called prosoche, which we translate as attention, but could also be translated as mindfulness or something along those lines. But it is very difficult to do it for any sustained period, and it's like a muscle that you have to build. Somebody who's you'd expect would be like totally about all attention all the time, who surprisingly says you can't do that, is René Descartes, the great 16th century mathematician and philosopher. People who read Descartes usually read the discourse on method and the meditations, and often only read the first two meditations, and they get this idea, I think, therefore I am, right? So he's thinking all the time. So when he's writing to this brilliant woman, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who had raised some problems for Cartesian metaphysics and philosophy of mind. He actually tells her at one point that most of the time what we're doing is not like the pure work of the intellect. It's actually our imagination drawn from, sense things, right? We're not doing this purely reflexive, metacognitive thing. And he says you can maybe do that like 1 hour a month if you're trained. So this is Descartes.
Yeah.
Somebody who has been training himself, definitely had like natural abilities. The guy was solving, unsolved algebraic equations as a young student in order to like get to sleep in. It was like a deal that he made with his like the rector of the school that he was at. So he had everything going for him. And even he's saying, yeah, you can't do this all that often. So now how does that tie in with good and bad and viewing ourselves as good and bad?
So the idea here is, one of the things that made me like go down this little rabbit hole was this Professor Dolly Chung over at NYU, who has this her rallying call, or like her core idea is to move yourselves to the idea of calling ourselves good-ish instead of good, just so that we are really constantly aware that we do have the ability to increase, that we have the ability to grow as humans. And
does she talk about the possibility of backsliding too, or if we're not choosing to focus? Or
I did not see that, so does not mean that she does not, though. I'm just not aware.
Well, do we want to talk about the practice that we think would help to promote this then?
Yeah,
because we're getting close to the end of our time.
Yeah, so reserving judgment is a practice that I believe is in several traditions, as well as the Stoics. The idea to, instead of when you see someone drunk in public, there's actually a very uncommon condition where people actually ferment grains in their belly, so they're not actually drinking any alcohol, but their body is producing alcohol and they're getting drunk anyways.
Wow.
Which is a very, very uncommon thing, but the idea is that you don't always know all of the story, and there could be lots of reasons behind why someone is acting in a way that you would call them good or bad.
Yeah, categorizing them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, somebody could be drunk in public, and it could be, it was their birthday, and they hung out with a bunch of friends who were all heavy drinkers, and they were the lightweight, and there you go. Or, somebody just broke up with them, and they're drowning their sorrows. That's not something they do every single day. And we could say this about a whole bunch of other things, too, where we see people doing things where we're like, yeah, I don't like people who do that. They're bad, We would say, well, we're not going to say that they. Epictetus says, don't say that somebody drinks badly. Say that they drink, more than they should. There's a very different value assigned to each of those. One is more factual. One is much more morally imbued.
And we can then take this and apply it to ourselves because of this idea of the bounded rationality, and we may not have conscious awareness of some of the things that we do, and we might realize that we have done something bad, and we can't just cause now I'm a bad person. It's like, no, I have the ability to be a better person because I have actually looked at myself and found something there.
Yeah, there's I think we could actually do a whole nother show about how people do improve themselves through focusing and discerning what they want to work on. But it looks like we're going to have to draw this one to a close.
Yeah. So we're going to leave you with the words of Seneca the Younger. We should seek out the knowledge and tools which are capable of immediate practical application, and learn them so well that words become works.